Nelson Mandela is remembered as one of the most powerful voices for freedom and justice in the modern world. The story of Nelson Mandela is filled with hope, courage, pain, and triumph, making his life an inspiration for millions across the globe. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvizo in South Africa. His father was Gadla Henry Mfakaniiswa, a chief who served as a counselor to the royal family of the Thembu people, and his mother was Nosikeni Fanny, a devout Christian woman who raised her children with discipline and faith. Nelson Mandela's birth name was Ralilala, a Xhosa word often translated as troublemaker, a name that would later seem fitting as he challenged the injustices of his time. His father died when Nelson Mandela was only 12, and this loss deeply affected him, but it also pushed him toward the guidance of the Thembu regent, who took Nelson Mandela under his wing. As a young boy, Nelson Mandela lived in the rural countryside, herding cattle and listening to elders share stories around the fire. These early years taught Nelson Mandela about tradition, community, and the importance of justice. Nelson Mandela also attended a local Methodist school, where a teacher gave him the name Nelson, following the colonial practice of giving African children English names. Although Nelson Mandela grew up in a world shaped by discrimination, he carried within him a strong sense of pride in his heritage. Nelson Mandela continued his studies with great determination. He attended Clarkberry Boarding Institute and then Healdtown, a Methodist secondary school. Later, Nelson Mandela enrolled at the University of Fort Hare, one of the few higher education institutions for Black Africans at the time. It was at Fort Hare that Nelson Mandela first became involved in student politics, standing up for fairness when he joined a protest against the university's policies. He was expelled for his activism, but instead of breaking him, this experience strengthened his belief in standing up for what was right. Nelson Mandela then moved to Johannesburg, where he worked while completing his studies. Eventually, he earned a law degree, becoming one of the first black lawyers in South Africa. In his personal life, Nelson Mandela married Evelyn Mays in 1944, and together they had 4 children. Their marriage faced struggles, however, especially as Nelson Mandela became more deeply involved in political work, and they eventually divorced. Later, Nelson Mandela married Winnie Madikizela in 1958, and the couple had 2 daughters. Winnie became an important activist in her own right, though their marriage also faced difficulties, and they separated after many years. In 1998, on his 80th birthday, Nelson Mandela married Graca Machel, who remained his partner for the rest of his life. Nelson Mandela's career began with law, but his true calling was fighting against the system of apartheid, a brutal policy of racial segregation in South Africa. Along with friends and colleagues, Nelson Mandela helped form the African National Congress Youth League, aiming to push for stronger resistance against unjust laws. Nelson Mandela quickly rose as a leader, organizing protests, strikes, and campaigns of civil disobedience. Yet his activism brought great risk. He was arrested many times, harassed by authorities, and eventually faced charges of treason. One of the darkest chapters of Nelson Mandela's life came after the famous Rivonia trial in 1964, where Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment for plotting to overthrow the government. He was sent to Robben Island, where he spent 18 of his 27 years in prison. The conditions were harsh. He lived in a small cell, worked long hours in a lime quarry, and endured very little contact with the outside world. Letters were censored, visits were rare, and hope was difficult to hold on to. Yet Nelson Mandela never gave up. He educated fellow prisoners, kept himself mentally strong, and became a symbol of resistance for millions outside prison walls. The world began to see Nelson Mandela not as a criminal but as a hero. Finally, after global campaigns and growing pressure on the South African government, Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990. His release marked a new chapter, not only in his life but in the life of his nation. Nelson Mandela immediately returned to political leadership, working with then-President F.W. de Klerk to dismantle apartheid. Together, they oversaw negotiations that led to the country's first democratic elections in 1994. In that historic election, Nelson Mandela was chosen as South Africa's first black president. His leadership focused on unity, reconciliation, and rebuilding a nation torn apart by centuries of racial injustice. As president, Nelson Mandela launched policies to improve education, healthcare, and housing, while also encouraging forgiveness rather than revenge. His approach amazed the world, especially because many expected anger and division. Instead, Nelson Mandela chose peace. Yet his presidency was not without challenges. South Africa faced deep economic inequality, high crime rates, and the spread of HIV/AIDS. Nelson Mandela worked tirelessly, but he also understood that change would take time. After serving one term, Nelson Mandela stepped down in 1999, showing the world his respect for democracy. In his later years, Nelson Mandela dedicated his time to charitable work, focusing on children's causes and the fight against HIV/AIDS. Nelson Mandela remained a respected figure globally, often traveling to share wisdom and promote peace. Despite declining health, Nelson Mandela continued to inspire people everywhere with his calm strength and humility. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. His death was mourned by the entire world, with leaders and citizens alike paying tribute to his extraordinary life. Today, Nelson Mandela's legacy continues to shine. Statues, schools, and institutions bear his name, and his story is taught to remind future generations of the power of resilience and forgiveness. Nelson Mandela showed that even in the face of cruelty and hardship, one person can change the destiny of a nation and inspire the world. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring life stories.